I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And please, Boulabus for co-director Darragh Carey. Come on up here. So just so you know, folks, we have 2 roaming mics with volunteers. If you want to ask Darragh a question, just raise your hand and they'll come and hold the mic out for you. So you can ask a question. But I'm going to just start with my own, Darragh, if that's okay. And basically, I just want to know how a fellow from Dublin ends up co-collaborating with the guy from Quebec about socioeconomic upheaval in Brixton.
Okay, well, does this sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm also blind, by the way. Look at this one. It started with a friend of ours. I went to film school with Rupert Bainham, the writer, and Bertrand Desroches, my co-director. And during film school, Rupert was working on a script about Brixton and about about this posh girl who felt like she wanted to get into the same world as people from a housing estate. And he was fascinated about the subject since he was in one of those posh schools in London, or outside London. So he went to Radley, which is basically like Eton and Harrow, one of the big posh public schools in the UK. And everyone there was obsessed with street culture and with black culture. And they would put on accents, they'd listen to the music, they'd be talking about it all the time. Meanwhile, they never interacted with anyone from that world. So Rupert was thinking, okay, well, why does this make me feel so uncomfortable? Because he was never comfortable with it. And he was like, what would happen if someone actually did try and make contact and acted on that urge to insert themselves into that culture? And that's where it all began. And then we all met in film school and then decided we'd make a feature straight away. I was getting on in years, so we thought, let's not make too many shorts. Let's get into a feature straight away, and that's how it came about.
Cool. So it was something of a kind of guerrilla production then, would that be fair to say?
In some cases, yeah. Like, we didn't have a lot of money, and we scraped together what we could. It ended up costing a little bit more than we thought it would. And we had to go back to our day jobs to pay for that, which was a challenge. No one will give you permission to make your first feature like this, about this kind of subject matter, with the credentials we had. So we thought, okay, let's not wait for permission. Let's just do it ourselves, and let's just, through pure obstinance and stubbornness, make it happen. And it took a really long time, but eventually we were able to make it exist as a movie. So
yeah, fair play. Well, the proof of the pudding's there on the screen. I just want to go back to you. You mentioned that this appropriation by the upper classes of the street culture and not interacting with them at all. But from what I understand, this was a very collaborative process that you and Bertrand entered into with the specific housing estate that you guys shot in.
Yeah, so myself and Bertrand and Rupert, the writer-producer, we all moved in to in and around Brixton. And we were working with the guys in Summer Leighton estate where the film is set, with the people there, with the community, and a bunch of the actors. I think they gave incredible performances. So Rose, Benji's mother, Dexter, Benji's cousin, and the guys from the rival estate, they were all members of the community. They also acted as script editors, and they worked on the crew. And it was incredible. I think you have a responsibility, I think, when you're going. We've been asked the question, why is this your story to tell? And I think the problem is that there aren't enough men writing women, and there aren't enough white people writing characters of color. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is representation, and also the fact that you have to do the research, you have to do the work and make it real and authentic. And that's why we spent so long in Summer Leighton estate. And the people we worked with there were incredible. Likewise, Benji's the actor who played Benji, Ola, and the actor who played Archie, Craig, they're both from similar backgrounds, So Ola's from Northwest London and Craig is from East London, but they come from similar kind of working class London backgrounds. And that was important to us to be authentic as far as we could.
Yeah, and you know, the film tackles exactly this, which is great. I think my favorite scene is sort of that moment of realization Benji has when he's at Lily's video installation at the gallery, and he has this realization that he's being used, kind of essentially, you know. And one gets the feeling that, you know, Lily's motivation, I suppose, for doing that comes from the fact that she's also this content creator, and like that this sort of mediation of all of our lives now drives that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing for me, especially being one of the older members of the core team, was that there's something I find very uncomfortable about the proliferation of social media culture rather than social media itself as a tool. I think there's a culture now where kids grow up looking at themselves and looking at each other on camera all the time. So everyone's used to looking at themselves in the third person, to having a persona. And I think that there's a pathology there, something that's unhealthy, so that you're always thinking about the image more so than the reality, or at least the idea of the image and the reality gets mixed up. And I think that's what happens to Leah in the story here, is that she kind of dissociates from reality because she's so preoccupied with the image that she's creating.
Yeah. I have to confess that the sun is somewhat in my eyes, so I can't see if people have questions, but just tap the mic or speak into it and let me know. In the meantime, I just want to go back to, you've mentioned casting a fantastic, or sorry, you talked about the fantastic leads that you got, but maybe talk about casting them.
Yeah, so we had a dual approach to casting. So we had a casting director, Lucy Rands, who did an amazing job finding the professional actors who had agents like Ola and like Lily, and Jamie Winston, of course. And then we also cast a bunch of the characters from the local estate. So the character who plays Darius, Dexter, he is from Summer Leighton Estate. He grew up there. So did Dennis Jamphy, our executive producer, who's also in the film as one of the guys who accosts Benji at the rival estate. And so is Rose Kerr, who plays Inez, Benji's mother. They're all from the estate. They're not professional actors, but they did an incredible job. They were an absolute pleasure to work with. And they were also really, really collaborative when it came to telling the story. A lot of the moments from the film came from real life.
Great. Yeah. So it wasn't a long process. It came from this collaboration with the Summer Leighton Estate.
Yeah, I think we started working with them like early on, and I think that is what helped us get a certain degree. At least I hope we achieved it of authenticity.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, so this is yours and Bertrand's first feature together. Yes, you've done a couple of shorts.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah. What's the shorthand like between you guys? Like, how do you collaborate? Is it a case of complementary strengths or sharing one mind, or how do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing about co-directing in our experience is that you really have to know exactly what film you're making and be on the same page about that. And no matter what's going on in your head, you can't be sure that that's what's in the other person's head, you know. So you have to put it out on paper. So what we did was we worked on the script for a really, really long time with Rupert, the writer, and she, another writer on the film. And we also had a big folder of references from other films that we loved and that we thought were had the right feel or the right look or the right pacing for the film. And we had it was huge, and we just made sure that we had all the same references because you can't shorthand between, especially two people from different cultures who have different first languages. You can't assume anything. So we made sure that everything was out in front of us on paper and in pictures so that we knew what the film was going to be.
Sure, great. If we don't have any questions, I might just... Yes, sorry, in front here.
Hi, thank you. I guess I have two questions. One is, how did the community that was represented in the movie receive it? Did they have any comments? And what does the movie do to portray colored people? Was there a discussion among that with the actors? Did they have something to say about it?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a two-part question, so I'll give you a two-part answer. So, first of all, the guys in the estate really they were really pleased to see the film. One interesting thing is that at the darker moments of the film, or some moments that were perceived by the general audience as a little bit darker, the guys from the estate found some of them kind of funny. Because their window of what is normal or what is everyday is very different. So there were some moments in the film where you'd see like some posh people in the audience were like horrified, but the guys from the estate actually saw the humor there in it that some of the other audience members would never necessarily see, because for them it's like there's something a little bit more challenging in the environment, more privileged people. Then, in terms of race, the cast, I think, are much more, because they're from London, they are much more conscious of, and the people in Summer Leighton Estate, they're much more conscious of class than they are of race, because London's race issue is so inextricably linked to class in a way where it's slightly different in the US, for instance. So I think the guys were a little bit more, they're a little bit more posh people and people from the estate, more so than they were like black people, white people, in terms of the divides. But there's obviously a correlation there in the UK as much as there is everywhere else. So I think their main concern was to make sure that it was authentic, that it wasn't fake, or an outsider's view of what their lives were like. And then when we worked with them in advance, we knew that what we were writing was going to be something that they didn't have a problem with because they were involved. Then a lot of the stories that came out of the film were things that really happened. So, for instance, there was a police officer who terrorized the estate, who would bring people to rival estates to pressure them. So those kind of things actually really happened, and I think that everyone from Summer Leighton Estate was, yeah, I mean, they didn't really talk explicitly to us about race throughout the project. It was something that was unsaid and implied. It was much more about class and about outsiders coming in and taking advantage. For instance, there was a documentary shot in that very estate a few years ago, and a few people went to prison because they shot some edgy footage that they thought was great, then published it, aired it, and they had people's identities up, like they were recognizable. So then they ended up getting arrested. Like, you have a responsibility, and I think that these people are used to that. They're used to people coming in, taking advantage, getting what they want and leaving. It's very much a neo-colonialist view of people from working class. And I think that that's something that we wanted to avoid as much as possible. So does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Do we have another question here in front?
Hi, yeah. So you spoke at the start about how this movie came about from a privileged position of being in private school where this kind of culture is just absorbed and lived in, even though it's not experienced. So were you hoping by this movie to make something that was a statement for privileged people to look at how we do appropriate that culture? Or is it more of an attempt to give a voice to the opposite side, to say this happens all the time and not often are we like confronted with that view? I'm just wondering which perspective were you hoping to come from? Because I think for me both came across, but I'm wondering what for you was the predominant vision for that.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, actually, because our stance on that changed throughout the course of making the film. Initially, we wanted it to be very balanced to the point where we're like, we understand where Leah's coming from, we understand where Benji's coming from, and to a point, it's the societal pressures that lead to a situation like this. So I think some of that balance remains, but I think we tip the scales a little bit away from the privileged point of view. And that kind of happened during the writing, but also during the edit. And part of it was that we didn't want to be making excuses for Leah. You know, there's only so much you can tell a balanced story when the cards are stacked so much against one side. So I think what happened in the end is we started giving a little bit less of a justification or an excuse, as we saw it eventually, for Leah's actions. So we wanted something that was neutral and that you could kind of make up your own mind. But we've found during the course of going through a few festivals in a few continents now at this point that I think there's definitely a slightly different reaction between like people from working class backgrounds and from people of color and from people from very similar backgrounds to Leah. I think the more similar to Leah's background, the less inured to the film people are, which I think is fine. There's enough films for those people, if you ask me.
Hear, hear. Do we have time for another question? And does anyone have one?
Oh, there's one. Look.
Where have we got?
Yeah, no worries. Did you have a similar process for portraying someone with mental health issues as you did for, say, a person of color? Or
Yeah, very much so. So initially, Archie was written as a character who had drug-induced psychosis. Or actually, initially it was a drug overdose, and then we moved over to a drug-induced psychosis, and then worked in throughout the script as we developed it that there were signs that he had mental health issues throughout. This particular kind of research came from my own life, because some people very close to me have severe mental health issues, and it's, for instance, that last scene where Benji and Archie are talking, and Benji thinks that, or Archie thinks that Benji is an imposter and that he's surrounded by actors. That's something that I experienced in a conversation with a loved one myself, and it's interesting because they come in and out of lucidity, you know. So at some points, on one side they realize who you are, and on the other side, the delusion is forcing them to think of you as an outsider and someone who's an imposter and not yourself. In fact, actually, since The Truman Show, at least I read it since The Truman Show, the most common delusion with someone with this kind of psychotic break is the Truman Show delusion, which is where you think that you're surrounded by actors or imposters or robots, and you're the only real person there, and you're being observed. And that's something I experienced firsthand. So we changed that from an overdose to that scene for that reason. I think it's something that when we talked to the guys in the state as well, that was quite prevalent, is that there isn't the same support for people in that kind of background when it comes to mental health. And I think we have some way to go here in this country, I think, as regards mental health care. But there you find a lot of people fall by the wayside because they don't have the resources or the support structures to keep them from that, which is why they're not as reckless. Like it may seem like, the people from the estate, they smoke loads of weed and stuff like that in a lot of estates like this, but they don't do psychotropic drugs a lot. Like, cocaine, Leah introduces Benji to cocaine. But in an estate like this, even if people are involved in crime and they're dealing cocaine, they never touch it. They're like, that's dirty, because it has, it's so addictive. They wouldn't do GHB, which is something that subtly happens in the film, that some guys do GHB. They have a very different approach to these kind of things, because the risks are much more severe, for someone from that background than for someone who does have those support structures ready to go, and for who societally is given a certain safety net.
Thanks very much. I think that's unfortunately all we have time for. Really quickly, Lily's career's been on the up and up. Ola's career's kind of taken off since you guys shot this, right? What's next for yourself and Bertrand?
Well, Bert actually is finishing off a script in Quebec, and it's based on a story of First Nations family and their experiences. And myself and Rupert are working on another few films on the slate. One of them is set in the public schools I mentioned earlier. It's a kid who kills his bully and tries to get away with it. And another one is about it's about trafficking, people trafficking, which is quite serious. But it's something that's like happening all around us, and we don't realize. Yeah, so that's what we're working on next.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to it. Thanks very much. Darragh Carey, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for staying around. It's very kind of you.